Hey there, welcome back to the third conversation, Conversations with No One, where I share stories of my character leading up to my paradigm shift into non-identification with duality, and also share my character's current adventures and how this state of non-identification informs his experience. I'm here today with my friend Snow, who may wander in and out of the frame occasionally. A few years ago, when I was studying hard to understand what my experience might mean and how other people express these truths that I was now living, I came across an article by a philosopher artist named Gary Z McGee. Gary Z McGee, it's kind of hard to say, on a website called Fractal Enlightenment. And the article was about something called Existential Masochism. So of course I had to read the article. The phrase itself I found extremely interesting. And as I read this article, light bulbs kept going on as I recognized my character, and this explanation of his behavior just made too much sense. Looking back at my life through this lens, a lot of previously confusing behavior made a lot more sense to me. In real time, it kind of rewrote the story of my story. And while this story is an illusion and its rewrite another delusion, I find it fascinating and possibly useful to share this with those who are still wrapped up in their own stories. So the phrase existential masochist sounds like someone who loves torturing themselves using philosophy, and in my case that's not completely wrong. But it's more about finding pleasure in transforming the pain of life into something useful. The simplest definition is it's the act of transforming pain into wisdom, which sounds a bit arrogant to me, but I like Gary McGee's description in the article. He said it's an approach towards pain as information, while holding oneself personally responsible for using that information in ways that enhance life in a healthy and meaningful manner. I'll post a link to this article in the descriptions if anyone is interested in reading it. Looking back on my life, it's obvious to me that I've always wanted to know the truth, whether it hurt me or not. As a younger teenager, I noticed that if I thought long and hard enough about the world and my perspective, I would inevitably reach a new perspective that completely replaced the old one. It had already happened a few times as a kid, and it was obvious to my young logic that this was a process that would probably repeat through my whole life if I kept at it. My metaphor at the time was like life was a giant gobstopper. If you don't know what that is, it's a large round candy, hard candy that can barely fit into your mouth. And when you first put it in your mouth, it's one solid color, but as you wear it down over time, sucking on it, a blue gobstopper might turn green, and then red, and then yellow. And if you didn't know that's what it was doing, you'd think that each time the new color appeared, that color was the real color of the candy. And so I promised myself I'd never allow myself to be tricked by that. And even though it's not possible, it helped me stay open to embracing each new layer as the old one was stripped away. Of course, using that metaphor, young me was looking to get at the center of that gobstopper, find out what was really there. But obviously I still got lost in many of the stories for a while and fell victim to a certain number of intellectual and spiritual narcissism on a level, as I used my big brain to make myself feel smarter and wiser. Smarter and wiser than other people. And that didn't really actually start to go away until my ego collapsed, my paradigm shift. But eventually, when each perspective stopped serving me or became obvious was hurting those around me, I always tried to look deeper at my own responsibility for my actions and behaviors, and I actually tried to figure out what was wrong or understand how I was wrong. As Marianne Williamson said, and Gary McGee quoted in that article, to endure the sharp pains of self-discovery rather than choose to take the dull pain of consciousness that would last the rest of our lives. And he goes on to describe it as a sort of mind hack and a way of being a mind, body, soul that remaps the way we move through the labyrinth of the human condition. I really enjoyed those words. I already identified with the practice of using mind or life hacks to nurture growth around uncomfortable change, so this really resonated with me. My whole life I was consistently changing my whole life in dramatic ways, simply to find out who I'd be in challenging and different environments. I'm pretty sure I learned this practice from growing up moving states every 2 years with my parents, and carried on my own as soon as I could. I even joined the Army Reserve at 17 because high school was too comfortable, and then dropped out of college a year or so after I joined to go active duty for reasons I went into more detail in my conversation about my metaphoric suicide. I even left my life in America behind for 10 years simply because I had an opportunity to. And this experience of reinventing myself over and over was so powerfully transformative and brought out so much of my untapped potential that I don't know, I've often been tempted to write a book about using this technique intentionally as a tool for self-improvement and spiritual growth. I've never seen it before, but hopefully other people have already written about this and I just haven't run across it yet. It doesn't seem like that radical or original an idea. And there was another quote from this article that was almost painfully spot on. Love should be embraced at the risk of pain. In one of the last conversations about asexuality, I described a period in my life I called the euphoric stage, where, full of unconditional love, I embarked on a handful of intense and powerful romantic relationships. I experienced heights and depths of love and pleasure I hadn't experienced before, along with the depths of pain and anguish I had never actually outwardly expressed in my life. And so the way this was described in this article about existential masochism, I don't know. It's kind of spooky how accurately it's described that period. So another quote I'd like to share from the article that relates to that is, I promise I won't make this all about the article completely, but I love this line. The secret of love is vulnerability, and the secret of vulnerability is courage. In order to truly love, we must be capable of being vulnerable, and vulnerability can be extremely painful. Vulnerability is being completely open to life, and thus completely open to pain. Insecurities rear their ugly heads, past traumas are awoken, and our fears are exposed as snarling demons hiding in the darkest depths of self. And that's absolutely what I went through, especially during those 5 years of intense relationships, painfully meeting myself over and over. And yet it feels like some higher self part of me knew exactly what I was doing by throwing my character into this crucible over and over until I came out the other side. I don't feel like it's any coincidence that I chose situations that put me on the other side of the fence that I had put other people in my life as well. Sort of like a karmic payment, if you will. And yet each time one of those intense relationships ended, I stepped out of the depths of what felt like my own personal emotional hell and right back into a place of peace and unconditional love. Like plunging into a cold pool after a few hours in the sauna. And it also seems to be exactly what I needed to finally break with my identification with my stories. I created several of these epic stories, lived them with all my heart and soul, and then stepped out of them again each time more my authentic self. It's hard to ignore just how much these stories were all self-written. And the idea of writing more just finally lost its appeal. It also seems like simple logic to me. Life is painful, so I can either use the information it gives me to suffer, or I can use it to grow. And I guess some part of me realized early on that that was my choice. And having that choice completely transformed the rest of my experience. And I'm still exhibiting signs of this existential masochism. By living in a converted shuttle bus, it means I'm constantly forced to push the boundaries of my comfort zone. It's obviously another one of my life hacks to keep me challenged. I'd say this YouTube channel is another one. And I think that's come through a few times in past conversations where I've admitted to feeling uncomfortable when things start to get too comfortable. Luckily, life will continuously and constantly throw curveballs, so I know I really don't have a lot to worry about that. I don't think life will allow me to get comfortable for too long, no matter what I do. Anyway, thanks for listening, and I appreciate hearing from you, whether you found that helpful or interesting, or want to tell me I'm full of shit. I love discovering I'm wrong about things, and as I might have mentioned earlier in this whole video. Anyway, have a great day.